The cake hit me square in the face before I even saw my son lift his hand. Frosting filled my glasses. Someone shouted. Chairs scraped across the floor. I stepped backward, caught my heel against a chair leg, and went down hard enough to send pain straight through my hip and lower back. For half a second, the room went quiet. Then everyone laughed. My daughter-in-law, Jessica, covered her mouth and said, "Come on, Dad. It's just a joke." My son Brandon was laughing too. It was my 68th birthday. I had cooked most of the food, set up the tables, chilled the drinks, cleaned the house before nearly 30 of their friends arrived. And after they finished laughing at me, they left to keep partying somewhere else. I was left alone with dirty dishes, crushed cups, food on the floor, and cake ground into the carpet. Then I opened their birthday gift, cleaning supplies. On top was a card with 4 words, "Keep the house clean." I stood there holding that card while my back throbbed from the fall. For years, I had told myself that everything I did for Brandon was what a father was supposed to do. That night, something changed. I packed a bag. What Brandon and Jessica didn't know was that the next 3 weeks would expose something neither of them was prepared to admit. They had spent years telling everyone they were taking care of me. By the time this was over, they would discover exactly who had been taking care of whom. And the birthday prank? That wasn't nearly as spontaneous as I first believed. My name is Raymond Collins. I was 68 years old, a retired regional hotel operations manager. And for most of my working life, I had been the man people called when a lobby flooded, a kitchen lost power, or 300 guests showed up to a property that was not ready for them. I had been a widower for more than 25 years, and for the last 4, I had lived with my only son, Brandon, and his wife, Jessica, outside Columbus, Ohio. Maybe that was why nobody thought it strange that I spent my own birthday working. By 7 that evening, the house was full enough that I could barely move through the kitchen without turning sideways. I carried a tray of sliders toward the patio while Jessica stood near the sliding doors rearranging cocktail napkins for the 3rd time. "Ray, not there," she said, pointing toward the far end of the table. "Put them by the warmer, people aren't seeing them." I moved the tray. She never looked at me. "Anything else?" "The ice bucket's almost empty." Of course it was. I went back inside. Nearly 30 people had come through the door, but I could count the ones who had actually known me before that night on one hand. There was our neighbor from 2 houses down, an old friend of Brandon's from high school who remembered me from football games. Linda Mercer, one of Brandon's co-workers, had introduced herself when she arrived. The rest belonged to Brandon and Jessica, men from his office, women Jessica knew from work or the gym. 2 couples I had never seen before who behaved as though they had attended parties in that house for years. I told myself that was fine. At 68, I did not need a room full of people singing my praises. Susan had always been better at birthdays anyway. She used to make a chocolate cake from scratch even after I told her not to bother. Brandon, when he was little, would hide behind the refrigerator with whatever gift he had made at school because he could never wait until after dinner to give it to me. Those birthdays were long gone. This one seemed to belong to everybody except me. Brandon crossed the room holding his phone and leaned toward Jessica. "He's still not here?" "Traffic, probably." "Did he text?" Jessica shook her head. I was close enough to hear them, but neither explained who they meant. A few minutes later, Brandon asked again. The 3rd time, I finally said, "You waiting on somebody important?" He looked almost surprised to find me beside him. "My manager, Dennis. I told you about him." Maybe he had. There were a lot of things Brandon said while I was wiping counters or carrying groceries that I apparently was supposed to remember. "Well," I said, "I hope he makes it." "He will." Brandon straightened his shirt and looked toward the front windows. That should have told me something. Instead, I went to refill the ice. I had spent the better part of 2 days preparing for the party. Jessica had ordered a few decorations, but I had handled most of the food because, as she put it, I was better with portions. That meant seasoning meat, slicing vegetables, making dips, organizing serving dishes, checking the propane, moving chairs, cleaning the guest bathroom, and making 3 separate trips to the grocery store because something kept being forgotten. Nobody had exactly ordered me to do all of it. That was the tricky part. They no longer had to. There was always a pause long enough for me to volunteer. Around 8, Dennis finally arrived. I knew immediately because Brandon changed. His shoulders went back. His voice got louder. He shook the man's hand with both of his and brought him straight to the patio. "Dennis, glad you made it. This is my dad's birthday." My dad's birthday. For the first time that evening, I almost laughed. I was carrying a bowl of potato salad when Brandon introduced me. "This is Dad. He keeps us all in line around here." Dennis smiled and held out his hand. "Happy birthday, Ray." "Thank you." Brandon clapped me on the shoulder. "He keeps the house running too. Retirement agrees with him." A few people laughed. I did too. I had become good at knowing when laughter was expected. Linda Mercer was standing nearby. She looked at the bowl in my hands, then at Brandon. "You're making the birthday boy work?" Before I could answer, Brandon grinned. "You try stopping him." That got another laugh. I smiled and took the potato salad outside. By the time Jessica announced that it was time for cake, my lower back already ached from standing most of the evening. I welcomed the chance to sit down. Instead, Brandon waved me toward the center of the dining room. "Come on, Dad, front and center." People gathered around. Jessica turned down the music. Someone dimmed the lights. And that was when I noticed the phones. Not after the cake came out. Before. 3 people near the dining table already had their cameras raised. Another woman stepped sideways to get a clearer angle. Brandon's friend Tyler held his phone horizontally and grinned at something over my shoulder. I remember thinking people recorded everything now. Dinner, dos, their own feet at the beach. Why not an old man blowing out birthday candles? Jessica brought the cake in, chocolate. For one quick second, the smell pulled me backward through the years. Susan standing in our old kitchen with flour on her cheek. Brandon sitting at the table, too young to keep a secret. I swallowed. "Make a wish," somebody called. The candles flickered in front of me. I leaned forward. I never got the chance to blow them out. Brandon's hand moved across my field of vision. Cold frosting struck my face. My glasses shifted sideways. For a second, I saw nothing but white and brown. My first instinct was to step back. My heel caught something solid. The chair moved beneath me. Then the floor came up hard. Pain shot through my hip and climbed into my lower back so quickly that my breath stopped. A woman gasped. Then somebody laughed. Another person joined in. Within seconds, the whole room seemed to break open. I heard Brandon laughing above me. Jessica's voice came through the noise. "Oh, come on, Dad, it's just a joke." I pushed one palm against the floor. My hip protested immediately. Someone reached toward me, but before I could see who it was, Brandon said, "Watch the carpet. There's cake everywhere." The words registered more clearly than the pain. "Watch the carpet." Linda was standing near the table. She had been laughing too, but now she wasn't. Her smile disappeared as she looked down at me. "Ray, are you all right?" There it was. The first question. It had taken longer than the laughter. I wiped frosting from one lens of my glasses and forced my mouth into a smile. "I'm fine." Brandon reached down and helped me upright. "That's my dad," he said. "Toughest guy in the room." People laughed again, this time with relief. The party could continue, and because I smiled, everybody had permission to pretend nothing had happened. I told myself I had done the mature thing. I told myself Susan would have wanted me to keep the peace. Then Brandon disappeared into the living room and came back carrying a brightly wrapped box. He placed it in my hands with a grin. "One more thing, Dad." I looked down at the gift. I thought falling in front of 30 laughing people was the worst thing my family had planned for my birthday. Then Brandon told me to open it, so I did. I peeled back the paper slowly because my fingers were sticky with frosting, and the room leaned in as though Brandon had saved the best part of the night for last. The box was heavier than I expected. I imagined something useful, in a good way, maybe a new travel mug or a book. Instead, I lifted the lid and found yellow rubber gloves sitting on top of a plastic cleaning caddy. Underneath were scrub brushes, microfiber cloths, bottles of cleaner, mop heads, sponges, and trash bags. I stared at it long enough for somebody behind me to snort. Brandon grinned. "Practical, right?" Jessica laughed and touched his arm. "We figured you'd actually use this." A few people laughed with them. Not everyone did. I noticed a couple near the doorway exchange a look and suddenly become interested in their drinks. Linda Mercer was still near the dining table. Her face had changed since I fell. She did not smile this time. I reached into the box and found a white card beneath the gloves. There was no birthday message inside, just 4 words written in thick black block letters. "Keep the house clean." The laughter came again, smaller this time, but sharp enough. I heard someone say, "That's cold." Brandon waved a hand. "Dad knows we're kidding." Jessica added, "Besides, he likes keeping busy." I looked at the card and assumed immediately that she had written it. Jessica was the one who usually left notes on the counter. "Pick up milk, wipe down guest bath." Don't forget the recycling. Nothing rude by itself. It was the steady accumulation that had changed the meaning. Somewhere along the way, requests had become assignments, and assignments had become expectations. The jokes followed the same path. The first time Brandon called me their maintenance department, I laughed because I had spent my career fixing problems, and the nickname almost sounded affectionate. Later, when the garbage disposal jammed during a dinner party, he introduced me as the only reason this house still functions. People laughed, and I took a bow. Jessica once told friends that having me around was cheaper than a cleaning service. She smiled. I smiled too. That was how these things survive. Nobody had to decide they were cruel if I agreed to laugh. I put the card back into the box. Well, I said, you certainly thought of everything. Brandon slapped my shoulder. See, he gets it. My hip hurt where I had landed, and my lower back had started to tighten, but the party rolled on. People finished drinks. Someone announced that a group was heading to a bar downtown, and suddenly half the room gathered near the front door. Brandon disappeared upstairs and came back wearing a different jacket. Jessica reapplied lipstick in the hallway mirror. I stood beside the kitchen island with the cleaning caddy still in my hands. You're going out? I asked. Just for a couple hours, Brandon said. Birthday after party. The phrase almost made me laugh for real. Jessica glanced toward the dining room. Plates covered the table. Plastic cups sat on windowsills. Napkins had been ground beneath shoes. Frosting marked the edge of the rug where I had fallen. Don't worry about all this tonight, she said. For half a second I thought she meant they would handle it in the morning. Then she added, just get to whatever you can. She said it casually, reaching for her purse. Not could you? Not would you mind? The cleanup belonged to me so completely that nobody thought a question was necessary. We won't be late, Brandon said. Enjoy the quiet, Dad. The front door opened and closed until the voices faded down the driveway. Then the house became still. I stood alone in the dining room, surrounded by proof that nearly 30 people had celebrated something there. I carried the cleaning caddy to the kitchen and set it on the counter. The rubber gloves sat on top like a punchline that had outlived the audience. Habit took over before pride could stop me. I gathered cups, scraped food into the trash, and stacked plates beside the sink. My hands knew the order even when I did not want them to. I bent to open the dishwasher. Pain seized across my lower back so suddenly that I stopped halfway down. I caught the counter with both hands and stayed there, breathing through my teeth. When I tried to straighten, the ache moved into my hip and held on. I waited until the room stopped tilting. Then I looked at the sink, the floor, the trash, the frosting on the rug, and the unopened cleaning supplies 3 feet away. For once, I did not push through it. I turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. The dishes stayed where they were. The cups stayed on the tables. The cake stayed on the carpet. By morning, the dishes were still where everyone had left them, and my son looked at that kitchen as if I had done something to him. Morning came before I was ready for it. I had slept badly, turning from one side to the other every time my hip reminded me of the fall, and by the time I heard footsteps overhead, the stiffness in my lower back had settled into something deep and stubborn. I was already at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee when Brandon and Jessica came downstairs. Brandon stopped in the doorway first. His eyes went to the sink, then the counter, then the dining room beyond it. Seriously, he said. Jessica stepped around him, still tying the belt of her robe. She looked at the plates, cups, and bags that had not moved since the night before. You didn't finish? She asked. Neither of them looked at me long enough to notice how slowly I had stood up that morning. Neither asked whether my hip was any better. Brandon walked to the sink and lifted one of the glasses, as if he had discovered evidence at a crime scene. Dad, what happened? I told you last night. My back hurt. You had all night to rest. He said it so easily that I stared at him for a second, waiting for some sign that he heard himself. Jessica opened the dishwasher and frowned. You could have at least loaded this. I tried. And I could barely bend. Brandon set the glass down harder than necessary. Come on, Dad. You're not 85. I felt something inside me tighten that had nothing to do with my back. No, I'm 68, and I fell hard enough last night that getting out of bed this morning took me 5 minutes. Jessica crossed her arms. Nobody's saying you didn't fall. We're saying you're making this bigger than it needs to be. I'm making it bigger? "It was your birthday," she said. "You got upset, everybody went out, and now the whole house is sitting here because you decided you were done for the night." Her tone made it sound as though I had abandoned a shift. I looked from her to Brandon. "That's what you think happened?" Brandon exhaled through his nose. "Dad, we're tired too." "From going out?" He ignored that. "We work all week, Dad. You don't." There it was, not shouted, not said in anger, just placed on the table like a fact everyone was expected to accept. I set my coffee down. "I retired. That's not the same thing as having no responsibilities." "I didn't say that. You just did." Brandon rubbed a hand over his face. "You know what I mean." "Do I?" Jessica looked away, already annoyed with the conversation. I kept my voice level. "I pay my own insurance, my phone, my car, my medication. I contribute to groceries and household expenses every month. I buy food on top of that when something runs out. I'm home for repair appointments. I handle deliveries. I keep track of half the things neither of you notices until they're missing." Brandon gave a short laugh without humor. "Nobody asked you to keep score." "I'm not keeping score. I'm reminding you that retirement didn't turn me into somebody with nothing better to do." Jessica shook her head. "This is exactly what I mean. One birthday joke and suddenly we're getting a lecture about everything you do." I looked at Brandon. "You threw cake in my face." He stared back at me. "Dad, you threw it in my face. I couldn't see, and I fell. I didn't make you fall." His answer came immediately, too quickly. "You stepped backward." "Because I had cake in my eyes. It was a joke." "That doesn't change what happened. It changes what you're making it into." For a moment, I saw him at 10 years old, standing in our old kitchen after breaking a window with a baseball. Back then, he had looked terrified of disappointing me. I remembered kneeling beside him and telling him accidents mattered less than what you did afterward. I wondered when that lesson had become something only I was expected to remember. Jessica picked up an empty cup. "Can we please not turn this into some huge family issue?" I didn't turn it into anything. "Then let it go." Brandon reached for his coffee mug. "Exactly." I watched him pour coffee as though we had settled something. That was the part that stayed with me. He was not pretending not to understand. In his mind, the problem was not that he had humiliated me, or that I had been hurt, or that they had left me alone with the mess. The problem was that I had refused to make the consequences disappear by morning. I pushed myself away from the table. "I'm going upstairs." Jessica glanced toward the sink. "So you're just leaving this?" I looked at her. "Yes." I moved slowly up the stairs, one hand on the rail. In my room, the cleaning caddy sat where I had dropped it the night before. The card was still tucked between the gloves and cloths. I pulled it out and held it near the window. "Keep the house clean." Thick black capital letters. Something about the E caught my eye. The middle stroke was shorter than the others. Then I noticed the K. Brandon had always made the lower arm too long. I had seen the same lettering the afternoon before, on masking tape labels he had written for the drink coolers. Ice, beer, water. I sat down on the edge of the bed and compared the memory with the card in my hand. Jessica may have chosen the cleaning supplies, but those words belonged to my son. For years I had told myself Jessica was changing my son. 4 words in Brandon's handwriting made that excuse impossible to keep. By Sunday morning, the pain had stopped feeling like something I could dismiss. I woke before 6, tried to roll onto my side, and felt a sharp pull across my lower back that forced me to lie still and breathe through it. My hip had darkened into a deep bruise, and when I finally stood, I had to keep one hand against the dresser until the stiffness eased enough for me to walk normally. I waited until Brandon came downstairs, hoping the sight of me moving slowly might say what words had failed to say the day before. He was already dressed for work, coffee in one hand, keys in the other. "I'm going to urgent care," I told him. He glanced at the clock. "Now?" "I don't think this is getting better." For a second, I thought he might offer to take me. Instead, he said, "I've got meetings all morning." Jessica came into the kitchen behind him. I asked whether she could drive me if I waited an hour. She shook her head before I finished. "I can't cancel everything today, Ray. You're still able to drive, right?" I was. That was not really the point, but I said yes. 20 minutes later, I eased myself into my car and drove across town with the seat tilted farther back than usual because sitting upright hurt. The urgent care clinic was already busy. I filled out the forms, explained the fall twice, and tried not to feel foolish when the nurse asked my age, and then asked whether anyone had come with me. No, I said. My family had things to do. She did not comment. After the examination, they sent me for imaging because of the tenderness around my hip and the way I had landed. Waiting for the results was the worst part. I had spent years telling myself I was still strong, still useful, still the man who could carry grocery bags in both hands and fix a cabinet hinge without asking for help. Sitting there in a paper gown, I suddenly wondered what one stupid moment had done to that confidence. The clinician returned with good news first. Nothing appeared broken. No major fracture. No sign that I needed the emergency room. I remember how relieved I felt hearing that. Then she explained what I did have: a lumbar strain and a deep hip contusion. Painful, sometimes slow to settle, but manageable if I stopped aggravating it. No heavy lifting for now, she said. Avoid repeated bending. Try not to stand for long periods. Light movement is fine, but don't push through sharp pain, and no strenuous housework until this calms down. I almost smiled at the last sentence. That may be the hardest instruction. She gave me a look that suggested she was not sure I was joking. Before I left, she printed the instructions and told me to follow up if the pain worsened, if I developed numbness or weakness, or if I was not improving. I folded the pages carefully and put them in the passenger seat. During the drive home, I felt oddly hopeful. That embarrassed me later. I had convinced myself Brandon simply needed something official in front of him. A diagnosis, a piece of paper, a professional telling him I was not being dramatic. When I walked into the house, Jessica was at the kitchen island with her laptop open and a yellow legal pad beside it. Good, you're back, she said. I was trying to figure out Saturday. I stood there with the clinic papers still in my hand. Saturday? The dinner. She looked surprised that I did not remember. We told you, about 20 people, maybe 22 now. She started reading from the pad. We'll need groceries by Thursday. The patio needs cleaning. Guest bath definitely needs attention. We should bring the extra table up from the basement, and I was thinking you could do the chicken because everyone liked it last time. I stared at her. Jessica, I just came from urgent care. That finally made her look up. What did they say? Nothing's broken. I strained my lower back and bruised my hip badly. So that's good. It is, but they told me no lifting, repeated bending, prolonged standing, or heavy housework for a while. Her eyes dropped to the paper, then returned to her list. Okay, well, we can figure out the table. It took me a moment to understand what she meant. Not cancel, not postpone, not handle the gathering themselves. Figure out the table. Brandon came home later that afternoon. I gave him the medical instructions before he had time to ask about anything else. He read the first few lines, or at least looked at them long enough to appear that he had. So nothing's broken? No. That's good. They want me taking it easy. He handed the pages back. Then rest today. Jessica, sitting at the counter, added, Saturday is still days away. Neither of them said it cruelly. That almost made it worse. They said it as if recovery were another household task I could schedule properly if I applied myself. I took the papers upstairs and set them on the dresser beside the cleaning caddy Brandon and Jessica had given me. The rubber gloves were still folded neatly on top. The doctor's instructions said what my body needed from me. The gift said what my family expected from it. I stood there looking at both, and something finally became clear. That was when I stopped wondering whether they understood I was hurt. They understood. They simply expected me to recover on their schedule. Jessica's yellow legal pad stayed on the kitchen counter for most of the afternoon. Every time I passed it, I saw the same list waiting for me. Groceries, patio, guest bathroom, extra table, chicken, serving dishes. For years, a list like that would have worked on me better than an alarm clock. I would have started mentally dividing the work into hours before I even sat down. That day, I only looked at it. Maybe that was because the doctor's instructions were still fresh in my mind. Maybe it was because Brandon's handwriting on the birthday card had unsettled something deeper. Either way, instead of reaching for Jessica's list, I found myself thinking about another kind of list, the kind I used to carry in my jacket pocket when I was still working hotel operations. Back then, every problem came with a deadline. A delayed furniture shipment in Cincinnati, a kitchen inspection outside Louisville, a new property opening in Cleveland with half the staff still untrained. I was good at that life. Better than good, if I am being fair to the man I used to be. I could walk into a hotel at 6 in the morning, find 20 things going wrong, and by dinner have half of them fixed and the other half assigned to people who knew exactly what to do. Promotions came quickly. So did the phone calls after midnight. What did not come quickly was the realization that every hour I gave to those hotels was an hour Susan was carrying something at home without me. Parent conferences, dentist appointments, homework, dinner, basketball practice, fevers in the middle of the night. Brandon's childhood was full of ordinary moments that I kept promising myself I would catch the next time around. The memory that hurt most was not some major family crisis. It was a Thursday evening after a 3-day trip. I came home carrying my suitcase and found Susan at the dining table helping Brandon with a school project. He was 11. I asked when his next game was. Susan looked at me before he did. Saturday. Good, I said. I should be able to make that one. Brandon kept working. He did not ask if I was sure. Later, after he went upstairs, I asked Susan why he had not seemed excited. She folded construction paper into a neat stack and said, "He stopped asking because he already knows the answer." I remember standing there with my tie still on and realizing my son had learned not to expect me before I had learned how much that would cost. I began changing after that. Not all at once. People rarely change all at once. I turned down trips when I could. I started coming home earlier. I attended games even when my phone buzzed in my pocket. For the first time, I thought I had enough years left to repair what I had neglected. Then Susan got sick. Her illness did not ask whether I was finally ready to become a better husband. It simply arrived. During those months, work became smaller very quickly. Hospital rooms have a way of teaching a man which parts of his life were never as important as he claimed. One evening when Brandon was 13 and asleep in a chair beside the window, Susan reached for my hand and said, "Just don't let him feel like he's alone in this world." I carried that sentence for the next 25 years. After she died, a promotion opened that would have put me over several states. Years earlier, I would have considered it the reward for everything I had worked toward. I turned it down before anyone could finish explaining the salary. I accepted a steadier local position instead. I made breakfast. I went to school meetings. I learned which teachers Brandon liked and which friends made me nervous. I sat through games in freezing weather and pretended I understood more about teenage music than I did. When college came, I helped with tuition. When his first car needed a transmission, I covered the shortfall. When he and Jessica married, I contributed what I could to the wedding. When they moved, I spent weekends carrying boxes and fixing shelves. If something went wrong, I stepped in before Brandon had time to feel the full weight of it. At the time, I called that love. Looking back, I could see how easily love had turned into habit, and habit into rescue. There was one memory I had not thought about in years. Brandon was 16 and had forgotten an important folder for school. He called the house in a panic. I grabbed my keys immediately. Susan stopped me at the door. "He can figure this one out," she said. "He'll get in trouble. Then maybe he'll remember it next time." I had been annoyed with her that morning. I thought she was being unnecessarily hard on him. Standing in Brandon and Jessica's kitchen all those years later, I remembered the scene without yet understanding why it had returned to me. Jessica's party list still sat beside the fruit bowl. Normally, by then I would have made a grocery schedule and checked what we already had in the pantry. Instead, I picked up the paper, read it once, and put it back exactly where she had left it. I had spent 25 years proving I would never abandon my son. For the first time, I wondered whether I had turned that promise into a life sentence. Linda Mercer called me late Monday afternoon. I almost let it go to voicemail because I did not recognize the number. When I answered, there was a pause on the other end before a woman said, "Mr. Collins, this is Linda. Linda Mercer. I was at your birthday." I knew immediately who she was. "I remember." Another pause. "I hope I'm not bothering you." "You're not." She took a breath. "I've been trying to decide whether I should call." Something in her voice made me sit down. Linda did not begin with small talk. She said, "I owe you an apology." I looked toward the kitchen, where Jessica's yellow party list was still sitting untouched. "For what?" "For laughing. The answer surprised me because she had been one of the first people to stop. Linda continued before I could respond. When Brandon threw the cake, I laughed for maybe a second. Everybody did. Then you went down and I realized you weren't pretending. I felt awful about it ever since. You stopped. That doesn't mean I didn't start. I did not know what to say to that. She did. I need to tell you something else. Her tone changed. Brandon had been talking about your party at work for weeks. I frowned. My birthday? Yes, but not exactly the way I think you understood it. Linda explained that several people from Brandon's office had been invited deliberately, including Dennis, the manager Brandon kept watching for that night. According to Linda, Brandon had been trying to build a better relationship with him for months. Nothing improper, no secret scheme, just the kind of professional socializing people did when they wanted to be noticed. He kept saying it would be casual, Linda told me. Family party, good food, nice house, easy way for people to get together outside the office. I remembered Brandon straightening his shirt when Dennis arrived, Jessica checking the food display, the bar arranged more carefully than anything meant for me. It was still your birthday, Linda said quickly. I don't want to make it sound like they invented that, but Brandon definitely used it as a reason to bring people together. That explained why I had spent my own birthday introducing myself to strangers. I looked around the kitchen. So that's what you wanted to tell me? No. One word. Quiet. Heavy. I waited. Do you get text messages on this number? Yes. I'm going to send you a screenshot. My phone buzzed a few seconds later. I opened the image. It was a group conversation with names I recognized from the party and several I did not. Most of the messages were harmless. Who's bringing ice? What time are you heading over? Does Ray drink bourbon? Then I saw Jessica's message. It had been sent less than an hour before the cake came out. Have your phones ready when Brandon brings out the cake. I read it twice. Then a third time. The room around me seemed to go very still. Suddenly, I could see the dining room exactly as it had been. Tyler holding his phone horizontally, the woman moving sideways for a better angle. 3 cameras already raised before I leaned toward the candles. They had not been filming a birthday. They had been waiting. Ray. Linda's voice brought me back. I'm here. I thought you knew. That sentence hurt in a different way. Knew what? That Brandon was going to do something with the cake. I figured it was one of those family pranks you'd all talked about beforehand. We hadn't. Oh God. She went quiet. I studied the screenshot again. Nobody had written, "Is Ray okay with this?" Nobody had asked whether I knew. They had simply assumed I must have agreed, because otherwise the whole thing would have been too ugly to enjoy. Brandon had intended to throw the cake. Jessica had known. Other people had been told to get their cameras ready. My fall had not been planned. I believed that. I did not think my son wanted me injured, but the humiliation had been planned. That distinction should have made me feel better. It didn't. Linda said, Dennis left earlier than he planned. I remembered seeing the manager's coat disappear sometime after the cake. Because of what happened. I don't know. I don't want to put words in his mouth. I appreciated that. Then Linda hesitated again. There's something else I probably shouldn't say. By then, I almost laughed. That usually means you're going to. She gave a small, embarrassed chuckle. Brandon talks about you at work sometimes. What does he say? Mostly that you live with them now, that he and Jessica are taking care of you since you retired. I did not answer. Linda must have heard something in the silence. I assumed that was the arrangement. I pay my own expenses. Oh, I contribute every month. I buy groceries. I handle things around the house. I didn't know. Of course she didn't. Why would she? Brandon had given everyone a much cleaner version. Successful son opens his home to aging father. Kind daughter-in-law helps support him. Poor dad gets to relax in retirement. Meanwhile, I cooked their meals, waited for repairmen, cleaned bathrooms, carried groceries, handled deliveries, prepared parties, and was handed cleaning supplies as a birthday present. For years, I had believed my son simply failed to notice how much I did. Now I had to consider another possibility. Maybe he noticed perfectly well. Maybe he simply told the story differently when other people were listening. Linda apologized again before we ended the call. I told her she had done me a kindness by telling me the truth. Afterward, I remained at the kitchen table with the screenshot glowing on my phone. My son hadn't simply made me the joke at my birthday. He had invited people to watch and then told those same people he was the one taking care of me. I left Linda's screenshot open on my phone for a long time after the call ended. The house was quiet, but for once the silence did not feel peaceful. It felt like evidence. I could see Jessica's handwriting on the yellow legal pad across the kitchen and Brandon's message thread on my screen. And suddenly, the whole week seemed to be asking me the same question. How many times was I going to let other people decide what my time was worth? The next morning, Jessica left an envelope on the counter beside a fresh grocery list. I knew what it was before I touched it. Cash for Saturday's gathering. Underneath, she had written out everything she expected picked up. Chicken, rolls, salad greens, bottled water, ice, dessert, paper plates, extra charcoal, and 2 kinds of dip. Usually, I would have checked the pantry before breakfast, circled what we already had, and planned the shopping around the least crowded hours. That morning, I read the list once and left it where it was. I made coffee, took my medication, and sat by the window. It sounds like a small thing. It did not feel small. Around 10, my phone buzzed. "Brandon, did you get the patio furniture cleaned yet?" I stared at the message. My back still hurt every time I stood too quickly. The doctor's instructions were upstairs. The screenshot from Linda was still fresh in my mind. I typed, "No, you'll need to handle Saturday yourselves." I read the sentence twice before sending it. My thumb hovered over the screen longer than I want to admit. Then I pressed send. Brandon called less than 30 seconds later. "Dad, what do you mean?" "I mean I'm not doing the party. I know you're not doing the heavy stuff. I'm not doing the light stuff either." Silence. "What happened?" he asked, as though I had developed a new medical condition overnight. "Nothing happened. I'm still hurt, and I'm not shopping, cooking, cleaning, or hosting 20 people this weekend." "We already invited them. Then you should probably start getting ready." "Dad," I could hear irritation hardening his voice. "I thought we talked about this." "You talked." I listened. "So this is about the birthday again. It's about Saturday." "No, it isn't." I did not answer. Brandon lowered his voice, the way he did when he wanted to sound reasonable. "Look, nobody expects you to move furniture. Just do what you normally do." There it was. Normally. A word that managed to erase every choice I had ever made. "I'm not doing what I normally do." He exhaled sharply. "Fine. Let me talk to Jessica." The call ended. Less than 5 minutes later, Jessica came into the kitchen with her phone in her hand. She had been working from the home office and apparently did not need an explanation. "Okay," she said. "We can compromise." I nearly smiled at the confidence in that word. "What's the compromise?" "Brandon and I can handle the patio, the table, and the heavier cleaning. You just do the food. Maybe the kitchen afterward if you're feeling better." I looked at her. "That's not a compromise." Her eyebrows lifted. "How is that not a compromise?" "Because you're still deciding which work I owe you." Nobody said, "Oh." "You didn't have to." She folded her arms. "Ray, we're trying to work with you." "Then host your own gathering." She stared at me for a moment, and I could see the shift from persuasion to offense. "You know what? Fine." She turned and walked away. Brandon called again that evening. This time he skipped the calm voice. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" "Nothing. You leave a grocery list sitting there. You refuse to help. Now Jessica's scrambling. What do you call that?" "A boundary." The word felt strange in my mouth, not dramatic, just unfamiliar. Brandon gave a bitter little laugh. "You're punishing everybody over one stupid joke." "I'm following my doctor's instructions. This isn't about your back." "Partly it is." "Then what's the rest?" I almost told him about Linda. Almost told him I knew the cake had been planned and that I knew what he said about me at work. But something stopped me. Maybe I wanted to understand my own decision before defending it to him. The rest is that I said no. He went quiet. Then he chose the one thing he knew had always worked. Mom always cared about family. I closed my eyes. For 1 second, I was back in that hospital room with Susan's hand in mine. Don't let him feel like he's alone in this world. The old guilt rose so fast it nearly carried the answer with it. I could have said fine. I could have told him I would do the food and stay out of the way. I could have convinced myself Susan would have wanted peace. Instead, I said, "Your mother cared about all of us." Brandon did not answer immediately. I don't even know what that means. Neither do I yet. I ended the call before I could change my mind. Upstairs, I opened the closet and pulled out an old duffel bag I had not used in years. I put in my medication first, then a few shirts, underwear, personal papers, Susan's photograph, and the road atlas she used to keep in the glove compartment on long drives. I did not pack much because I still had no plan. I did not know whether I would be gone 2 nights, 2 weeks, or whether I would lose my nerve before I reached the front door. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't certain where I was going. I was only certain that if I stayed, they would turn my first no into another yes. I left the duffel on the bed overnight. That was how uncertain I still was. The next morning, before Brandon or Jessica came downstairs, I sat at the small desk in my room with my laptop open and looked at numbers I had not studied carefully in years. My retirement deposit, my savings, the money I received each month, what I spent on insurance, medication, my car, food, and the contribution I made toward the house. I went through it twice. Then I leaned back in the chair. I had enough. Not enough to live extravagantly, not enough to behave as though money no longer mattered, but enough for a modest apartment if I wanted one. Enough for hotels for a while. Enough to buy my own groceries, pay my own bills, and make decisions without asking Brandon for permission. That realization embarrassed me. I had spent years acting as though I lived in their house because I had nowhere else to go. That had never been true. Money had not kept me there. Something else had. I found a hotel about 20 minutes away and booked a room for 4 nights. It was close enough that I was not committing myself to anything permanent, but far enough that I would not be tempted to drive back every time Brandon called. I packed slowly because my back was still sore. Medication, a few shirts, underwear, my shaving kit, personnel documents, Susan's photograph, her old road atlas. I left almost everything else where it was. The cleaning caddy stayed on the dresser. I looked at it before walking out of the room and decided that was exactly where it belonged. There was no dramatic plan behind my leaving. I did not cancel anything connected to the house. I did not hide the serving trays or move the patio supplies. I did not take food they had already bought. I did not touch Brandon's money or interfere with Saturday's gathering. If their party failed, it would not be because I had sabotaged it. It would simply be a party they had to host themselves. Brandon saw the bag when I reached the bottom of the stairs. He was standing in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading something on his phone. His eyes dropped to the duffel. "What's that?" "A bag. I can see that." Jessica looked over from the island. "Where are you going?" "A hotel for a few days." Brandon stared at me, then gave a short laugh. "You're serious?" "Yes." "This is ridiculous, Dad." I did not answer. Jessica folded her arms. "So what is this supposed to be? Are we supposed to beg you to stay?" "No." "Then what do you want?" That question should have been simple. I realized I did not know the answer. "I want some space." Brandon shook his head. "You're going to spend money on a hotel because you're mad about a birthday joke?" "I'm leaving because I need time to think." "About what?" "About why I'm here." His expression changed slightly. "Not fear. Not yet. Mostly irritation. You live here because we're family." "I know. And because this arrangement works. For you." Jessica let out a breath. "There it is." Brandon set his mug down. "Fine. Go cool off." He pointed toward the bag with his chin. "You'll be back when you calm down." There was almost amusement in his voice. He still believed I was performing. Maybe part of me was. I had spent so many years making sure Brandon never experienced my absence that he had no reason to believe I could maintain one. Jessica picked up her coffee. "Just don't expect us to chase after you." "I don't." I walked toward the front door. To reach it, I had to cross the dining room. The chairs had been pushed back into place. Most of the evidence from the birthday was gone, but near the edge of the rug, a faint brownish mark remained where cake and frosting had been stepped into the fibers. I stopped for a second. That was where I had gone down. A few feet away was where people had stood with their phones raised. I wondered whether Brandon would ever look at that spot and remember the same things I did. Then I kept walking. Nobody followed me outside. The hotel was ordinary. That helped. There was nothing luxurious about the room. Nothing that made leaving feel like a vacation. A bed, a chair, a television, a small desk, and a window overlooking the parking lot. I set the duffel on the luggage rack and sat carefully on the edge of the mattress. For the first time in 4 years, I was staying somewhere that belonged to neither Brandon nor Jessica. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt guilty. The room was too quiet. I imagined Jessica looking at the grocery list, Brandon moving the patio chairs, Saturday getting closer. Then I heard Susan's voice in my memory. "Don't let him feel like he's alone in this world." I looked at her photograph on the nightstand. "Am I doing that?" I asked. Of course, the room gave me no answer. My phone buzzed that evening. Brandon, what time are you coming home tomorrow? We need to start prep. I read the message twice. Not, are you okay? Not, how's your back? Not, can we talk? What time are you coming home? I turned the phone face down. They thought I had left to make them miss me. The truth was, I had left because I no longer knew who I was when nobody needed something from me. For the next few days, my phone kept reminding me that leaving the house did not automatically mean leaving the job. On Wednesday morning, Brandon texted, "Where are the extra serving trays?" I told him they were in the cabinet above the basement stairs. An hour later, Jessica asked which grocery store carried the rolls I usually bought for parties. I answered that too. By Thursday, the questions had changed shape but not purpose. What cleaner do you use on the patio table? Where's the extension cord for the outdoor lights? Do we still have the large drink dispenser? How much chicken would you normally buy for 20 people? That last message sat on my screen for several minutes. I knew the answer. Years of hotel work had trained me to estimate portions almost without thinking. I could have told Brandon exactly what to buy, how much extra to allow, and what could be prepared the night before. My fingers even started typing. Then I stopped. I was sitting in the hotel lobby with a cup of coffee, answering questions about a party I had already said I would not host. Different building, same job. I deleted the message. A few minutes later, Brandon sent a question mark. I put the phone in my pocket. The strange thing was that I did not want Saturday to go badly. That surprised me. A small, angry part of me wanted them to discover what they had taken for granted. I would be lying if I said otherwise. But I did not want guests standing around hungry while Brandon and Jessica embarrassed themselves. I did not want appliances breaking or food ruined or anything else people might call revenge. Mostly, I wanted to know whether leaving had meant anything. Saturday morning, I woke earlier than usual. My back was improving, though sitting too long still made it stiff. I walked slowly around the hotel parking lot after breakfast, then returned to my room. I expected the phone to start ringing by noon. It didn't. 1 o'clock passed, then 3, no calls. I checked the screen several times, pretending I was looking at the time. By 5, I caught myself wondering whether I should send a message. Need anything? The words appeared in my head automatically. I did not send them. Around 7, I opened social media. That was when I saw Jessica's photographs. The first showed their living room. Clean. Not just presentable. Spotless. The floors shone. The furniture had been arranged neatly. Fresh flowers sat on the dining table. The second photograph showed the food. Professional catering trays lined the kitchen island. Chicken, salads, appetizers, desserts. Everything looked better arranged than the meals I usually prepared. There were disposable warming pans underneath, nice serving utensils, small printed cards beside several dishes. The patio looked just as polished. Guests were smiling around the fire pit. Someone had strung lights above the seating area. The tables looked clean. Drinks sat in large tubs of ice. I stared at the pictures longer than I should have. There was no obvious crisis, no mountain of dirty dishes, no one standing beside an empty buffet wondering where dinner was. Jessica had captioned the photographs with something cheerful about a wonderful evening with good friends. I scrolled through them twice. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Brandon. He had sent me one of the photographs directly. Underneath it were 3 words. See? We managed. I felt the sentence somewhere deeper than I expected. If he had told me they were angry, I could have defended myself. If he had asked me to come home, I could have said no. But this was different. They had handled it. They had hired a cleaning service. They had ordered catering. They had apparently figured out the patio, the tables, the ice, and everything else without me. For several days, I had imagined my absence creating an empty space they could not ignore. Looking at those photographs, I wondered if there had been no empty space at all. Maybe I had exaggerated my importance. Maybe the things I did were convenient. Nothing more. Maybe Brandon had been right that I kept busy because I had time, while 2 working adults could simply pay someone when necessary. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the hotel room. Suddenly it felt less like independence and more like a place an old man had gone because he was angry. I pictured my bedroom back at the house, my chair, my coffee mug in the kitchen cabinet, the ordinary rhythm I had known for 4 years. I could drive home the next morning. Nobody had told me I could not. I could say I had made my point. We could all pretend the week had taught us something and move on. My hand went to the car keys on the desk. Then I thought about the reason I wanted to return. It was not because Brandon had apologized. He had not. It was not because Jessica had asked how I was feeling. She had not. It was because their successful party had frightened me. I wanted proof that I mattered. And if I went home simply because they had demonstrated they could survive without me, then I would be making the same mistake in a different direction. I had left because I needed to understand what I wanted. That question did not disappear just because the chicken came from a caterer. I set the keys back down. Then I turned off my phone and opened Susan's old atlas. I had expected one Saturday without me to prove what I meant to them. Instead, it forced me to ask a harder question. What if I had to choose myself even if they never missed me? The atlas stayed open on the hotel desk that night, but I did not choose a destination yet. For the first time since leaving Brandon's house, I was trying not to make my next decision based on what my son might do. That turned out to be harder than I expected, because by Monday morning, Brandon's calls had started again. Not desperate calls, not apologies. Question. Dad, do you remember which company serviced the air conditioner last year? I gave him the name. The next day, he called again. Where do you keep the extra furnace filters? Garage cabinet. Top shelf. There was a pause. Right. Neither conversation lasted more than a minute. By Wednesday, another problem appeared. A repair technician was scheduled to look at a leak under the kitchen sink. Normally, I would have been home to let him in, explain what I had already noticed, and sign whatever paperwork needed signing. This time, nobody was there. Brandon called me from work. The guy says he waited 20 minutes. I'm sorry. Jessica couldn't leave. I had a meeting. I waited. For years, that sentence would have ended with me offering to fix the problem. Instead, I said, you'll have to reschedule. Another pause. Yeah. That evening, Brandon sent a message saying the technician could not return until the following week. The house did not flood. The kitchen did not collapse. Nobody's life was ruined. It was simply inconvenient. That was the pattern. Small things. The kind of things nobody counts because individually they look too ordinary to matter. One evening, Jessica had to stop for groceries after work, then pick up dry cleaning, then drive across town because the store near them was out of something she needed. Brandon spent part of Saturday waiting for a lawn service because the grass had gotten ahead of him. A delivery that I would normally have accepted had to be moved to another day. Takeout containers began appearing in the photographs Jessica occasionally posted. None of that made Brandon and Jessica helpless. That mattered to me. They were intelligent adults with jobs, cars, phones, and enough money to solve most ordinary problems. They could clean a bathroom. They could buy groceries. They could wait for a repairman. What they were beginning to discover was that every one of those tasks cost something. If not money, then time. If not time, then inconvenience. Often all three. Brandon called Thursday evening while I was eating dinner. Do you know what people charge for yard work now? I nearly laughed. Not because I enjoyed hearing him struggle, because for years, mowing, trimming, sweeping the patio, and keeping things in order had apparently been worth nothing when I did them. Now someone had printed a price on an invoice. No, I said. What do they charge? He told me. I whistled softly. Exactly, he said. And cleaners aren't cheap either. Plus the catering Saturday. Sounds expensive. It is. I waited to see whether he would say the obvious thing. He didn't. Instead, he asked where I had bought the replacement filters for the refrigerator. I told him. When the call ended, I sat looking at my plate and understood something I had missed before. Brandon was beginning to see the value of the work, but he was still calling me mainly because of the work. That difference mattered. The next morning, Jessica sent me a photograph of a cabinet hinge and asked what size screw I had used the last time I repaired it. I knew. I almost answered. Then I looked at the message and thought about how many years I had solved problems before either of them had to notice the problem existed. I put the phone down. An hour later, I sent back one sentence. You can take the old screw to the hardware store and they'll match it. That was enough. I was not refusing to be a father. I was refusing to remain a remote maintenance department. After that, I stopped checking my phone every 20 minutes. I stopped wondering whether the lawn had been cut or whether the sink was still leaking. Their inconvenience could not become my new hobby. That afternoon, I spread Susan's atlas across the hotel bed. The cover was worn soft at the corners. When I opened it, I found circles in her handwriting I had forgotten about. The Great Smoky Mountains, Charleston, Savannah, little stars beside roadside towns we had once said we would visit someday. I traced one of the circles with my finger. Susan had loved planning drives. She would sit beside me with that atlas open across her knees, marking places that looked interesting even when we had no vacation scheduled. For years, I had kept the book without actually following any of those lines. I checked the distance south. With my back still healing, I knew I could not sit behind the wheel all day, but I could drive a few hours, stop, stretch, stay somewhere overnight, then continue. There was no reason to hurry. That realization felt almost as strange as leaving home. I booked a room for the next stop, packed my duffel, and placed Susan's atlas on the passenger seat. Brandon and Jessica's house was not falling apart without me. It did not need to. Something more important was beginning to fall apart instead. The story that I was the one being supported. The farther south I drove, the less often I checked the rearview mirror as if Columbus might somehow be following me. I took my time, stopping every hour or so to stretch because my back still tightened if I sat too long. By the time I reached eastern Tennessee, the hills had begun to rise around the highway, green and layered in the distance, and for the first time in years, I was traveling without somebody waiting for me to arrive and start working. Susan's atlas lay open on the passenger seat. One of her old circles sat near the Smokies, but another name had been in the back of my mind for most of the drive: Eugene Parker. Jean and I had worked together nearly 30 years earlier, back when hotel openings meant 16-hour days, and neither of us believed our knees would ever hurt. We had kept in touch through Christmas cards, then occasional phone calls, then the kind of silence that happens when years pass faster than friendships can keep up. I remembered he had settled outside Knoxville after retiring. I found his number in my contacts and sat in a parking lot for several minutes before calling. He answered on the fourth ring. "Ray Collins?" I laughed despite myself. "You still have my number? I still have people in there who've been dead 10 years. You think I'm deleting you?" His voice sounded older, but the humor was exactly the same. We met for lunch the next day at a small restaurant Jean liked. The moment he saw me, he opened his arms and said, "There he is, the only man I ever saw calm down a wedding party, a kitchen fire, and a state inspector before breakfast." That was not the same morning. It was in my memory. I had forgotten what it felt like to be remembered that way. At Brandon's house, being capable meant knowing which cleaner worked on the stove. Jean remembered the man who could walk into a property full of problems and make people believe there was a way through them. We talked about old coworkers, bad managers, hotels that no longer existed, and Susan. Jean did not ask what had happened to me in the careful tone people use when they expect tragedy. He simply listened. Eventually he leaned back and said, "So what do you want to do now?" I started telling him about Brandon. "Well, the house is managing, apparently. They've hired people for some things, and Brandon keeps calling about—" Jean raised one hand. "Ray." I stopped. I asked what you want to do. The answer should have been easy. Instead, I stared at my coffee. "I don't know." Jean nodded as if that were a perfectly acceptable answer. "Then you've got something useful to figure out." His phone rang before I could respond. He glanced at the screen. "My daughter," he answered. I could only hear his side. "Hey, sweetheart." He listened for a moment. "Tonight? No, I can't tonight. Tomorrow afternoon works." Another pause. "Sure. Love you too." He hung up and returned to his coffee. That was it. No argument, no accusation, no long explanation about why a father should always be available, his daughter had asked. Jean had said no. They still loved each other at the end of the call. I must have been staring because he frowned. "What?" "Nothing." But it was not nothing. I carried that little exchange with me for the rest of the day. 2 evenings later, Jean asked if I wanted to come with him to a fundraising dinner at a local community center. "Just dinner," he said. "You're not working." I told him I would come. When we arrived, I understood immediately why he had emphasized that. Volunteers were rushing through the hall, moving table numbers, looking for extension cords, and trying to figure out why the serving line would force guests to cross directly through the entrance. The old part of my brain woke up before I could stop it. I saw the bottleneck. I saw that 2 tables needed to move. I saw the trays arriving in the wrong order. For years, I would have stepped in automatically. I even started toward one of the volunteers before catching myself. Not my event, not my responsibility. Jean noticed. "You see something, don't you?" "A few things." "Would you like to help?" The question hit me harder than it should have. Would you like to? Not "Ray, handle this." Not "You're here anyway." Not "You're better at this, so it's yours." I looked around the room. For a little while, I can't lift much. Then don't. So I helped. I suggested moving 2 tables to open the entrance, reorganized the serving order, and showed one volunteer how to stage the trays so people were not carrying hot food through a crowd. I stayed away from lifting and took breaks when my back warned me to. No one complained. No one acted as though I owed them another hour because I had given them the first one. By the time guests arrived, the room flowed smoothly. An older woman wearing a volunteer badge came over afterward and touched my arm. "Jean says you used to run hotels. A few of them." She smiled. "Well, you saved us a mess tonight. Thank you." 2 simple words. Thank you. I drove back to my hotel thinking about how different they sounded from "we need you." I had spent years confusing usefulness with love because both could make a man feel important, but usefulness freely chosen felt nothing like obligation disguised as family. For the first time in years, someone needed something I knew how to do, and still asked whether I wanted to do it. Jean's daughter called him again the next morning while we were having coffee, and the conversation lasted less than a minute. She needed help moving something into her garage. Jean told her he would come by after lunch. She thanked him, and that was that. No apology for asking. No guilt for saying no the night before. No invisible ledger of what a father owed his grown child. I watched him put his phone back on the table and found myself thinking about Brandon at 16. The memory came back with surprising clarity. He had left an important folder on the kitchen counter before school. He called the house in a panic, asking me to bring it. I was already reaching for my keys when Susan stepped between me and the door. "Let him figure it out," she said. I remember being irritated. "He needs it today. Then he'll remember that tomorrow." "Susan, it'll take me 15 minutes. She looked at me in that quiet way she had when she knew I was missing the point. Being there for him doesn't mean doing everything for him. At the time, I thought she was being strict. I drove the folder to school anyway. Brandon got what he needed, and I felt useful. That was the pattern long before I recognized it. I solved the problem in front of me and told myself that was love. Another memory came with it, from a year or 2 earlier. Brandon had complained about having to do his own laundry after ruining a favorite shirt. I told Susan we could help him until he got the hang of it. She shook her head and said, "We're raising a man, Ray, not somebody who'll need us forever." I had laughed then. "He's 13. "Exactly," she said. "That's when you start." Sitting across from Jean decades later, those words no longer sounded strict. They sounded patient. Susan had been teaching Brandon something I spent the rest of his life quietly undoing. The thought followed me back to the hotel. I took Susan's photograph from the nightstand and set it beside the open atlas. For years, one memory had been louder than every other memory of her. The hospital room. Brandon asleep by the window. Susan's hand in mine. "Just don't let him feel like he's alone in this world." I had treated that sentence like an instruction manual. When Brandon struggled, I stepped in. When money was tight, I helped. When he moved, I carried boxes. When something broke, I fixed it. When marriage and work made life busy, I filled the spaces. If Brandon needed something, I heard Susan's voice telling me not to leave him alone. But that was not the only thing Susan had ever believed about raising our son. Illness had compressed her final months into something so powerful that it overshadowed years of ordinary wisdom. She had wanted Brandon loved. She had also wanted him capable. I had taken one true request and stretched it until it became something she had never asked me to do. That realization hurt because it did not let me place every ounce of blame on Brandon and Jessica. Their behavior was still theirs. Brandon chose to throw the cake. He chose to write the card. Jessica knew what was coming and laughed when I fell. They had dismissed my pain and expected me to keep working. Nothing about my mistakes erased theirs. But there was another truth I could no longer avoid. Every time I rushed in before Brandon experienced inconvenience, I taught him something. Every time I solved a problem he could solve himself, I made rescue feel normal. Every time I called sacrifice just what fathers do, I made it easier for him to believe my time belonged to the family by default. I had not taught him cruelty, but I had spent years making sure his choices rarely cost him much, when I could absorb the cost instead. That was mine to own, not with shame. Shame had already wasted enough of my life. I needed to own it because it told me what I had to do next. Leaving Brandon's house could not remain a punishment. If I stayed away only until he suffered enough, then my life would still be organized around his behavior. I would just be controlling him from farther away. What I needed to stop was simpler. I needed to stop teaching him that Dad would always be there to absorb whatever he did not want to carry. My phone rang that evening. Brandon. I considered letting it go, then answered, "Hey." His voice was less angry than before. "Where are you?" "Tennessee." Silence. "Tennessee?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I wanted to come here." He seemed to have no immediate response to that. Then he asked, "How long are you actually staying gone?" The word "actually" caught my attention, as if everything before this had been temporary theater, as if there had always been an invisible date when I would return to normal. I looked at Susan's atlas, spread across the bed. "I don't know yet." "Dad, come on. I mean it. We need to figure this out." "We will." "When?" I almost gave him a date. My old instinct reached for one, something that would make him feel secure. Instead, I said, "When I'm ready." There was a long pause. For the first time, I understood that Brandon was not asking me a question he automatically had the right to answer. My time belonged to me. My decision belonged to me. Even my love for him did not change that. For 25 years, I thought making Brandon stand on his own would betray Susan. That night, I finally understood she had been asking me to teach him exactly that. Brandon called 2 days later, and the first thing I noticed was his tone. No irritation. No clipped questions about filters, repairs, or groceries. He sounded tired, but controlled. "Dad," he said, "I've been thinking." I sat in the chair beside my hotel window and waited. "About what?" "About everything you were doing at the house." That was enough to make me listen more carefully. He started naming things without making excuses. Meals, cleaning, waiting for repair people, running errands, keeping track of supplies. Little jobs he said he had never really counted because they were always handled before he noticed them. "I get it now," he said. "You were doing a lot more than we gave you credit for." For one brief moment, I felt something inside me loosen. Not forgiveness, not yet, but hope. "I'm glad you see that." "I do. And Jessica does too." There was a pause. "So, come home." The words landed exactly where he expected them to. A week earlier, I might have packed before the call ended. Instead, I said, "What would be different?" "A lot." He sounded prepared. "We've talked about it. You wouldn't have to do as much. We could get someone in for the heavy cleaning every other week. You wouldn't need to cook every night, maybe 3 nights, tops, and we'd handle the yard stuff." I closed my eyes. There it was. Not a father being invited home, a worker being offered a better schedule. Brandon kept going, unaware that every sentence was making the answer clearer. "You'd have more free time. We could make sure you're not overdoing it. Jessica even said we could split the grocery runs." "Brandon." "What?" "Listen to what you're saying." He went quiet. "I am listening. You're offering me fewer chores." "Well, yes, that's part of it. Because you think the problem was that I had too much work, wasn't it?" I looked out at the parking lot below. A couple was loading suitcases into an SUV. Nobody seemed to be in a hurry. "No," I said. "The problem was that you thought the work belonged to me in the first place." His voice tightened. "Dad, we're trying here." "I know you think you are. Then what do you want?" That question again. This time I had an answer. "I want to be your father." Silence. "You are my father. Then stop talking to me like I'm negotiating a job." He let out a frustrated breath. "That's not what I'm doing." "It is exactly what you're doing." I kept my voice calm. "I'm not negotiating better working conditions, Brandon. I'm your father. I was never your employee." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then I heard Jessica in the background. "Put me on speaker." A second later, her voice came through clearly. "Ray, nobody said you were an employee. You didn't have to. We're trying to compromise. A compromise requires 2 people deciding what each of them owes. I don't owe you housework. You lived here too," she said, "and I contributed, every month, on top of everything else. We know that. Do you?" Neither of them answered. Jessica tried again. "So what? You're just never coming back." "I'm not coming back to the same arrangement." Brandon cut in. "Nobody is asking for the same arrangement. You just described it with fewer hours." His patience finally broke. "What do you want from us, Dad? You want us miserable? Is that it? You want to sit down there in Tennessee while we scramble around proving some point? No, because that's what it feels like. I didn't create your responsibilities. I stopped carrying them. Same difference. No, it isn't. He laughed once, bitterly. You sound like you're enjoying this. That hurt more than I expected. You think I enjoy hearing you struggle? I think you enjoy being right. Before I could answer, he reached for the oldest weapon in the room, even from 500 miles away. If Mom could see what you're doing to this family, she'd be ashamed. For a second, every part of me went still. There had been a time when that sentence would have ended the argument. I would have heard Susan's voice in a hospital room and confused guilt with duty. But now another memory stood beside it. Being there for him doesn't mean doing everything for him. We're raising a man, not somebody who'll need us forever. I breathed out slowly. Your mother wanted you loved, Brandon. She also wanted you able to stand on your own. Don't twist Mom into this. I'm not. Then stop acting like abandoning us is some lesson she would approve of. I'm not abandoning you. You left. I moved out of your house. Those are not the same thing. Jessica said nothing. Brandon did. And I don't need people at work knowing our family business either. That caught me. What does work have to do with this? Nothing. Too fast. I thought of Linda immediately. Her apology. The screenshot. Dennis leaving early. Brandon? Forget it. Something had happened. I could hear it in the way he rushed past the subject, but I did not chase him. Not yet. I'm going to go, I said. Fine. I love you. He did not answer for a second. Then quieter. Love you too. The call ended. I sat there with the phone in my hand, surprised by the steadiness I felt. Brandon had used his mother's memory to pull me back more times than he would ever know. This time, it didn't work. Exactly 3 weeks after my birthday, Brandon called me just after dinner. I almost did not answer, not because I was angry. By then, anger had stopped being the loudest thing I felt. I had spent enough time away from the house to hear my own thoughts without somebody else's needs interrupting them. Still, when I saw his name on the screen, I waited until the third ring. Hey. His voice sounded different, not softer exact. Smaller. Dad, I cleaned the kitchen last night. I looked at the phone. All right. It took me almost 2 hours. I said nothing. Brandon gave a short breath that might have been a laugh at himself. I thought I was done after the dishes. Then I saw the stove. Then the floor. Then I realized the trash was full. Then I remembered the recycling. Then Jessica asked if we were out of coffee filters. I could hear him moving around somewhere. I kept finding another thing you used to do. That sentence landed differently from all the lists and complaints that came before it. Not because he had finally noticed chores, because for the first time, he sounded embarrassed that he had not noticed them sooner. I didn't know, he said. You didn't ask. I know. There was no defense attached to it. No explanation about work. No reminder that I was retired. He continued. Jessica and I were talking last night. We built our whole week around you without ever asking if you wanted that. I leaned back in my chair. Outside the hotel window, evening traffic moved along the road below. What do you mean? I mean, we made plans because you were there. We stayed late because you could handle dinner. We scheduled people during the day because you could be home. We invited people because we knew you'd help. We stopped even talking about it. He paused. We just assumed. That was the first time Brandon had described the problem without immediately proposing a new schedule for me. I let the silence stay there for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been sitting with me since Linda called. Do you still tell people at work that you and Jessica support me? He did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. No. You used to. Yes. Why? Another pause. I don't know. You do. I heard him exhale, because it sounded good. There it was. I liked being the guy who had his dad living with him. Like I was doing the right thing, taking care of family, while I paid my own expenses. I know, and contributed every month. I know, and took care of half the house. I know, Dad. There was shame in his voice now, but I did not rush to make him feel better. That would have been the old pattern too. Then he said, Linda talked to me, so that was it. I waited. She said I should be ashamed of what happened at the party. And Dennis left early because of it. Dennis. The manager Brandon had kept watching for that night. He didn't say much at the time, Brandon continued, but Monday at work he asked me if you were okay. I could hear how much that simple question had bothered him. What did you say? That you were fine. I almost corrected him, then decided not to. He looked at me and said, he didn't look fine. Brandon swallowed audibly. Then another guy from the office, Paul, heard us talking. His father died last year. I remembered a quiet man with gray hair standing near the patio. Paul told me he'd give anything to have one more birthday with his dad. Brandon's voice broke slightly on the last word, but he kept going. I thought everybody would think it was funny. I thought Dennis would see me as relaxed, fun, whatever. Instead, I could tell people were looking at me differently afterward. There was no dramatic punishment, no lost job, no ruined career. Something simpler had happened. Brandon had wanted people to see him as generous, successful, and devoted to family. Instead, for one ugly moment, they saw exactly how he treated his father when he thought everybody would laugh. He had lost control of the story. I asked, "What about the card?" Silence again. Then he said, "I wrote it." "I know." That startled him. "How?" "I know your handwriting." He gave a small sound, almost like air leaving him. I thought it would get a laugh. It did. "I know." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Brandon said, "I'm sorry." I waited for the rest. There was no but, no joke, no explanation, just the apology. "I'm sorry I threw the cake. I'm sorry I wrote the card. I'm sorry I left you there to clean up. And I'm sorry I acted like everything you did was something you owed us." I closed my eyes. It was what I had wanted to hear. That did not mean everything was repaired, but it mattered. Finally, Brandon said, "Can we meet?" He did not say come home. He did not ask when I was returning. "Face to face," he added. "Whenever you're ready." I looked at Susan's atlas on the table beside me. All right. After we ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes. Then I picked up my phone again and made another call. Not to Brandon, to a moving company. For the first time, Brandon didn't ask me to come home. And for the first time, I knew exactly why I was going back. I pulled into Brandon and Jessica's driveway a little after 10 on Saturday morning. For a few seconds, I sat behind the wheel, with both hands resting on it, looking at the house I had called home for 4 years. Nothing about it had changed. Same brick, same maple tree near the sidewalk, same front window where Jessica usually kept a lamp burning in the evenings, but I had changed enough that the place no longer felt like somewhere I belonged by default. Brandon opened the front door before I reached it. He looked past me toward my car. "You made good time." I left early. His eyes went to the duffel in my hand, then back to my face. For the briefest moment, I saw relief. Not quite a smile, but close. "Come in." Jessica was waiting in the living room. The house looked clean, though not in the polished way it had for their catered party. It looked lived in. Brandon pointed toward the couch. "Can we talk first?" I sat carefully. My back was much better than it had been 3 weeks earlier, though I still felt a dull pull if I moved too quickly. Jessica sat across from me. Nobody reached for small talk. Brandon started. What I said on the phone wasn't enough. I waited. I planned the cake thing. Hearing him say it face to face felt different. I thought it would be funny. I thought everybody would laugh. I didn't think you'd fall. I know. But after you did, I still laughed. He looked down, and then I acted like the carpet mattered more. That part had stayed with me. I wrote the card too. I know that. I know you know. I just needed to say it. Jessica leaned forward. I knew about the cake. Her voice was quieter than usual. I sent the message telling everyone to get their phones ready. I looked at her. She did not look away. I thought it was harmless. I thought you'd get mad for a minute. Everybody would laugh, and that would be it. And when I fell, her mouth tightened. I should have stopped laughing. Yes. I should have helped you. Yes. There was no point making the answer softer. Jessica nodded. After you left, Brandon and I spent the first week arguing. About what? She gave a humorless little laugh. About whose job everything was. Brandon shifted beside me. The groceries. Dinner. Repairs. Cleaning. Yard stuff. Jessica continued. I kept saying he should do certain things because they were his responsibility. He kept saying I should do them because I noticed them first. She looked embarrassed now. Then one night I said, "Ray always handled that." And Brandon said, "Ray handled everything." Neither of us spoke for a moment. Jessica rubbed her thumb against her palm. That was when I heard how ridiculous we sounded. She glanced around the room. We had divided the house into our jobs and Ray's jobs without ever asking Ray if he wanted the job. I appreciated the words, but appreciation was not the same as going backward. Brandon looked at me. So what happens now? We try to be a family. His shoulders loosened slightly. Then he asked the question, "Are you staying?" "No." The relief disappeared. "Dad, I told you on the phone. I'm not coming back to live here. I thought maybe after we talked in person. I wanted to talk in person because you're my son." He looked toward the stairs. "You have a room here." "I had a room here." Jessica spoke carefully. "So you're really moving out?" "Yes. I don't understand why it has to be permanent. Because if I move back, all of us will spend the next year trying not to fall into the same habits." Brandon shook his head. "We can change. I hope you do. Then give us the chance." "I am." He stared at me. "Just not by moving back." That was when the sound of a diesel engine came from outside. Brandon turned toward the window. A white moving truck slowed in front of the house. His face changed. "You hired movers?" "Yes." The truck stopped. 2 men climbed out. For the first time that morning, Brandon fully understood why I had come back. Not to test them, not to scare them, not to collect an apology and restore the old arrangement. I had come for my things. We spent the next couple of hours going through my room. Most of what I owned fit into fewer boxes than I expected. Clothes, books, photographs, a few pieces of furniture, personal papers, Susan's belongings I had kept all those years. Brandon helped without arguing. Jessica labeled boxes. Nobody tried to stop me. Near the end, Brandon opened the closet and pulled out the plastic cleaning caddy. The yellow gloves were still folded on top. He held it awkwardly. "Do you want this?" I looked at it. 3 weeks earlier, that box had told me exactly what they believed my place was. Now it looked smaller, almost foolish. "No," I said. Brandon waited. That was never really a gift for me. His eyes dropped to the caddy. "I know." He carried it downstairs. By late afternoon, the truck pulled away toward the modest apartment I had rented outside Columbus. Nothing luxurious. 1 bedroom, a small balcony, a kitchen I could clean when I wanted to, and a front door that belonged to me. Before I left, Brandon hugged me. Not tightly, not dramatically, just enough. "I'll call you," he said. "All right." Jessica said, "Come for dinner sometime." "I will." I believed I meant it. Then I got into my car and followed the moving truck toward my own home. I had finally taken my things out of their house. Months later, I would learn whether Brandon had taken the lesson out of that birthday. By the time autumn reached Ohio, my apartment no longer felt like somewhere I had moved because I was angry. It felt like home. I knew which floorboard near the kitchen made a faint click, which chair caught the afternoon sun, and which neighbor liked to sit outside with coffee before anyone else was awake. I had taken 2 short trips since moving in, one back through Tennessee to see Jean and another farther south with Susan's atlas on the passenger seat. Brandon and I spoke regularly, but not every day. That mattered. Sometimes he called just to ask how I was doing. Sometimes Jessica sent a photograph of something they had cooked. Once Brandon asked whether I knew a good plumber. I gave him a name. When he asked if I could come over and wait for the appointment, I said I already had plans. "All right," he answered. Nothing followed, no guilt, no reminder that he worked all week. Just all right. That small exchange meant more to me than another apology would have. A few months after I moved out, Brandon invited me to dinner. "Nothing big," he said, "just a few people." I almost asked who was coming, then decided it did not matter. I arrived at 6:30, exactly when he had asked me to. For years, I would have shown up an hour early carrying serving utensils, extra food, and a mental list of things that needed checking. That evening, I carried 1 chocolate pie from a bakery near my apartment. Brandon opened the door wearing an apron. "You're right on time." That was the invitation. He smiled. "Come in." The house smelled like roast chicken and rosemary. Jessica was setting water glasses on the table. She did not hand me anything when I entered. That sounds like a strange detail to remember, but I noticed it. I sat down. I talked. I let somebody else worry about dinner. There were 6 of us, including Tyler, one of Brandon's friends who had been at my birthday. The meal was good. Brandon had overcooked the carrots, but nobody died. Jessica laughed about it, and he laughed too. When dinner ended, I stood automatically and reached for my plate. Brandon took it from my hand. "Leave it, Dad. I can carry a plate." "I know." He stacked another one on top. "You're a guest." I sat back down. Part of me felt ridiculous for how much those 3 words affected me. Then Tyler leaned against the counter and grinned. "Look at this." The housekeeper finally came back to work. The sentence was almost familiar enough to be harmless. Almost. I saw two people start to smile out of habit. Months earlier, I might have joined them just to rescue the room from discomfort. Before I could say anything, Brandon turned. "No." Tyler blinked. "What?" "Don't." The smile on Tyler's face weakened. "Come on, man, relax." It was a joke. Brandon looked at him for a long second. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I said too." The room went quiet. Tyler straightened. Brandon did not raise his voice. "My dad helped us for years. We treated it like he owed us. He didn't." Jessica stood beside the sink. "He's right." Tyler looked toward me. "Ray, I didn't mean anything by it." "I know," I said. And I did. That was the strange part. Months before, I would have needed everyone in that room to understand why the joke hurt. That night, I did not. Brandon's defense mattered because it showed me something about him, not because I needed it to prove something about myself. The conversation moved on eventually. People always think dramatic moments last longer than they do. Someone asked about dessert. Jessica made coffee. Tyler apologized again before he left. I drove back to my apartment feeling lighter than I had expected. Brandon had been given almost the exact same choice he had faced on my birthday. He could make the room comfortable by laughing at me, or make the room uncomfortable by standing beside me. This time he chose differently. That did not erase what happened. It did not need to. Change was more convincing when it looked like behavior instead of speeches. A few weeks later, I drove south again. Susan had circled Savannah in the old atlas years earlier, so I finally went. I walked slowly along streets she would have loved and had lunch alone without feeling lonely. For years, every place we had never visited felt like evidence of something I had failed to give her. This time I allowed the memory to be simpler. I missed my wife. I loved her. I had made mistakes. All three things could be true without turning the rest of my life into repayment. Brandon and Jessica continued managing their own home. They hired cleaners occasionally. They split errands. Sometimes they asked my advice. Sometimes I helped. Sometimes I said no. Nobody stopped loving anybody because of it. Months later, I was at their house for another quiet dinner. When the meal ended, I reached for the plates without thinking. Brandon took them from me. "I've got it, Dad." I smiled. "You sure?" "Go home. Don't you have somewhere to be tomorrow?" I did. I was leaving early for a drive through Kentucky, another place Susan had marked years ago. I put on my coat. Jessica hugged me at the door. Brandon told me to call when I arrived. Neither asked when I was coming home. They finally understood that I already had one. For years, I thought being a good father meant never leaving when my son needed me. Susan had tried to teach me something better. Sometimes loving a grown child means stepping aside, letting him carry his own weight, and finally giving yourself permission to carry only your own. Looking back, I do not think the hardest lesson was learning how much Brandon and Jessica had taken for granted. The hardest lesson was realizing how long I had helped them believe my time, energy, and love were things they could use without asking. I had confused sacrifice with devotion and guilt with responsibility. There is nothing wrong with helping your children, even after they are grown. But help should still be recognized as a gift, not treated like a debt a parent must keep paying forever. If someone you love begins to expect your service while ignoring your health, your feelings, or your dignity, do not wait until resentment destroys everything. Speak clearly. Set boundaries early. Learn to say no without writing a long apology afterward. And do not keep rescuing capable adults from every inconvenience simply because watching them struggle makes you uncomfortable. Sometimes consequences teach lessons that advice never can. At the same time, I do not believe revenge has to mean destroying the people who hurt you. I never wanted my son to lose his marriage, his home, or his future. I wanted him to understand that love does not give anyone ownership over another person. The best thing I did was stop trying to prove my value by being useful. I built a life that belonged to me again, and when my family finally learned to respect that life, we found a healthier way to love each other. Sometimes justice is not watching someone fall. Sometimes it is simply refusing to carry them anymore.